Hey everyone, it's Will, Gamer Dad, with another video for you. So in today's video, we're going to go over Harle as a 5-star from the collab, and I'll do a little bit of gameplay and let you know what I think about her. But the most important question of all is
she hot or not?
Well, she reminds me of Harley Quinn from Batman, and so I would never recommend dating a psycho. That's your daily dad advice for today. Anyways, Harle in the game from the Complex stream is actually a very powerful Lunatic shade user, and she's a magic user, of course. Her VC's pretty decent. Self-speed 50%, status immunity 2 times. Note that this VC does not support other units, just boosts herself. And like all the other collab units, she does have power levels, and she can go up to 12 power levels, and that actually plays very well with her moves. So if she can get to the full 12 power stacks, you can do some significant damage with most of her special moves. Now you can see the 3 moves we're going with: Lunar Ruin, Lunar Cut, and Lunar Breaker. And so Lunar Ruin is the move that you're probably going to use the most for stacking power levels. So 2 power levels, obviously Fire type XL single target, int self up, and depending on how many levels, if you can get to the 12 levels, you can obviously int plus 100. Not really sure if you're going to be spamming this over and over again and then trying to get one more buff at 100 or not. However, you can also use a Lunar Protection to boost your stack 3 power levels. I would recommend not using Lunar Protection unless you really need a defensive mode for Harle. Being that she's a Lunatic shade user, she's basically built for offense. I mean, it's nice to have a protective move there, but I don't think I would use that on a regular basis. Now, that being said, her other 2 moves, Lunar Cut is essentially the shade AoE, and it allows you to put shade type resistance down 35, and at max stacks of power levels, you can get negative 70% type resistance down. So that's quite a bit to help power her damage against enemies. I don't think there are that many bosses who are weak to shade. Lunar Breaker, of course, is her spam move, magic AoE, shade type, increased damage based on number of stacked levels, again up to 12, and increased strength depending on number of debuffs on the enemy, which is up to 8 debuffs. Now, in general, it's actually pretty hard to get 8 debuffs unless you have multiple units applying different debuffs for your team. You can obviously tailor your loadout to kind of help with that, and you can also use enhanced Grasta Ore to apply things like power, speed, and int occasionally down if you really wanted to do that. Okay, so this is her board. And I will say that in my experience, I would say that I can apply 6 debuffs, but let me know in the comments below if you found a reliable way to just really have a loadout that applies 8 debuffs to the enemy. Now, in terms of her elements, she can equip elements just like the others in the Complex Stream collab, that is Harle and Kid and Surge. And being that she's a shade type user, you could obviously not just customize to shade, you can use other elements as well. Keep in mind that her main moves are the ones that are doing more damage, and we can do a little bit of comparison later on with the Black Hole move, for example, which is given from this element equipment versus from her base Lunar move. If you're wondering why I have to equip my Grasta, usually I have this done already. However, I kept on moving things around, both for Battle Simulator, aka Boss Rush from the newest release. And so I do apologize for that. But we're going with the standard stuff, and you can see, if you're wondering how I do things, I actually have a set number of Grasta for each weapon type, and I kind of move things around depending on either what I'm demonstrating or what I'm trying out. So, let's take her out for a spin. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate it. I also do have a Patreon account for those who want to support me this way. So obviously, we're going to start with the Lunatic, just to kind of show what the advantages and disadvantages are. Now, for those who aren't aware, Lunatic Shade has a different effect than Lunatic Thunder and Lunatic Crystal. Lunatic Shade essentially converts all her defense into attack, and so you can see that when she activates Lunatic, she is very, very vulnerable to a lot of hits, and so I would recommend only activating Lunatic either at the beginning of AF or right before an AF, provided she doesn't get hit. And so again, safest bet is to probably do it in the first rotation of AF, and I'll demonstrate that a little bit later on in that video as well. Otherwise, the real use of her is obviously to use the Lunar Ruin first to stack power levels, and then use one of her other moves afterwards. Keep in mind that other than the Lunar Ruin and the Lunar Protection, their other shade moves do not power the levels. So you really want to stack as many stacks as you can with the Lunar Ruin before doing some of those powerful moves. So in this case, we're going to do 9 power levels, and we're going to use the Black Hole, which is the equipment or element that you can equip. So you can see with all the setup, it is 116,000 damage. Keep in mind that I believe at top power levels, it only multiplies by 2 for those equipment, whereas watch the number here. If you do use the Lunar Ruin for 3 times, which is 9 stacks again, the damage is quite a bit more significant. 200k versus the 100 something k. So again, I don't recommend playing around with the elements for Harle. I mean, if you really need some variance, you can obviously do that, but there are other units you can use for different elements as well. Might as well play this specialty. Now, in our first example, I do find that obviously being that Harle is a magic user, she works best in Magic Zone. Now, I do know that Surge obviously does the dual strike stance. However, I find that you can draw a lot more with that mental focus, which is given by the likes of AS Chio and AS Rosetta. So we're just going to set up here with a 2-turn AF. Note that I am spamming Lunar Ruin after activating Lunatic. Lunatic lasts for 3 turns, and note that since we are in AF and we're not getting hit, she is not going to be vulnerable to get killed. And so, that is really the safest way to activate Lunatic. Now, note that AS Clark is also a Lunatic user. However, she is Crystal, and that does different effects. So, again, he is not nearly as vulnerable as Harle when getting attacked while in Lunatic mode. Keep that in mind when you are building teams to fight certain fights. With enough Grasta and enough setups, and especially with the number of debuffs you can apply on the enemy, Harle can do a lot of damage. So, I'm using Lunar Weapons, which can apply 3 different debuffs on the enemy, and also on top of that we can use Rotation from AS Clark, which gives an additional 2 debuffs. And so with that, you can see the damage is more closer to the 50 million, obviously with Pain status activated as well. But like I said earlier in the video, I think getting to 8 debuffs is a little bit more challenging. I'll have to probably play around with the setups more to see if it's relatively doable. And keep in mind that if we have multiple units with lunar weapons, I believe that each individual debuff does count, even though they have diminishing returns. So we're not really here to stack the debuffs for helping with type resist down. We're more like stacking the debuffs so they can get up to 8, in which case you can do the maximum amount of damage with Harle. So, I mean, the fact that she does have a setup, she needs multiple stacks of the Lunar Ruin, and then Lunatic activation on top. Obviously, that limits her use in some sense, but, if you can draw that power, you can really do a ton of damage, which you can clearly see with the 49 million or 50 million that we did in the first example against Melosia. And in our second and final example, you've seen us fight the twins many times. I mean, it's not as difficult now as it used to be. We have the power of immense amounts of Grasta. We also have more powerful zone units, and so on and so forth. Keep in mind that against a lot of these fights where the unit is dependent on having debuffs, you really need to have the fight where these units don't kind of remove their debuffs either through kind of a refresh, or in the case of Melosia, where there's multiple waves where each one is different from the last, and so those debuffs don't stay. For example, in Battle Simulator, aka Boss Rush, I'm not sure if Harle would perform nearly as good. I mean, obviously she has Lunatic. However, again, Lunatic lasts only 3 turns, and if you're up against high-powered units, 1 hit will probably end her. Not only that, but in order to try to apply 8 debuffs wave after wave, it limits her usefulness in that sense. But enough talk about that. We're here to demonstrate how powerful she can get when she is in full Lunatic and multiple debuffs on the enemy. So you can see I cast Rotation again, and you can definitely use different examples of doing that. So we push to the second HP stopper. Note that the twins do remove zone, and so we don't have the benefit of having the end of turn buffs from AS Chio in this fight. And even without that, you can still get almost 16 million with Harle. So she is definitely a powerhouse under the right circumstances, and as more and more super bosses or enemies become vulnerable or even weak to shade, I think she's going to be a valuable add. Remember, she is a free unit, and so having a free Lunatic shade unit is extremely good, even as a magic user. If anyone has Thilly Lily, you know that or Milsha, for example, those shade Lunatic attacks can be quite powerful. Certainly, you're trading off damage for safety and obviously physical and magical defense of those enemies once you activate the shade Lunatic on. Other than that, that's pretty much it. I know some of these examples might be pretty boring. You've probably seen these fights over and over and over again, but really I'm just trying to kind of show some basic examples of how to use Harle. There are obviously a lot more complex ones you can do, and certainly if you play around and experiment with those units, you can do even more challenging fights than the ones I've demonstrated to you. Okay, so again, you've probably seen the loadout with some of my other videos. They're pretty much the same. Myris is obviously not grassed up. I moved all her Grasta earlier to Harle, and so you see the standard bullseye enemy numbers and so on and so forth. I will say that without the power of that Grasta, you won't see nearly the large numbers that you see in these examples. And so, for every player, whether or not you're in the early, middle, or end game, you really do have to have a stack of those bullseye, MP consumption, enemy numbers, and so on and so forth, Grasta ores that found from either Underworld or Future Gerlia. So in conclusion, Harle is a great add. She's free. She can do a significant amount of damage given the right setup. And, she works really well in magic zones. Obviously, with dual strike stance, she can obviously work with Harle and, Kid and Surge as well. But I'll take free Lunatic Shade units anytime. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.